St. Paul said he was the chief of sinners only because he never met me. From the age of 12 to the age of 19, when I entered the United States Navy, I sold drugs on the streets every day and committed every imaginable sin under the sun. And then during Navy boot camp, I met Jesus Christ, and I had a radical transformation, a radical conversion, and I followed Jesus with all my heart. And I seen him change this sinner. And people that knew me said, wow, I'm not the same. It was real. Jesus was real, and my transformation was real. I was baptized Catholic as a baby and made my first Holy Communion, and then kind of fell away from the Catholic Church. And when I had this conversion with Jesus, looking back, I know it was my Catholic baptism that drew me. But at the time, I didn't realize it, and I followed the Lord in the evangelical Protestant tradition. And I was told that the Catholic Church preached a false gospel and the popes were antichrist. And not only did I believe this lie, I repeated it and drew many Catholics out of the church into evangelicalism. But then, after about 30 years of this, the Lord was drawing me back home to Rome. He was back drawing me, and he was showing me in the scriptures. I got to understand and love the scriptures so much. I started to see how much sense the Catholic Church makes and how the church was Catholic from the very beginning. And as I started to watch Pope Francis, I was surprised. I was always told these popes are just like politicians and just like fake Christians, leading a fake church. And the first time I saw Pope Francis speak, I was like, wow, this man truly loves the Lord. This man truly knows Jesus in a deeper way than I even know. That may sound prideful, but us evangelicals thought we knew the Lord better than anybody. And the more I watched Pope Francis, the more I seen what a Christ-like man he was. And I was no longer surprised when Rick Warren, a popular evangelical mega pastor here in America, said he met Pope Francis, and Pope Francis is the most Christ-like person he's ever met. He believes Pope Francis is the most Christ-like person on the planet today. This is coming from a Protestant mega pastor. And a man that I loved, the late Louis Palau, who they called the Latin Billy Graham, said he was so excited when he heard Pope Francis was the Pope, because he knew Pope Francis and he knew he was a spirit-filled man of God who loved the Lord and loved God's people. And as I watched him, he spoke my language. And looking back, I realized, like St. Paul said, I became a Jew to win some Jews. Pope Francis became a Protestant to win some Protestants. And he's won so many of us. He's brought multitudes of us back home to our church of our baptism, the Catholic Church. And then when I listened to his dear friend, the late Bishop Tony Palmer, talk about Pope Francis, made me fall in love with Pope Francis even more, but it also made me realize why Pope Francis loved the late Tony Palmer. What a godly man, what an awesome man the late Tony Palmer was. And Pope Francis led Tony Palmer, who Tony Palmer, being an Anglican bishop, a Protestant bishop, said, Pope Francis is my spiritual father. This is a deeply spiritual man that loves the Lord and has such wisdom and knowledge of God that he looked up to Pope Francis as a spiritual father. And Pope Francis led his wife, Tony Palmer's wife and children, to come back home to the Catholic Church. And a few people told me that Tony Palmer was coming home too, and Pope Francis said, no, be a bridge. You're a bridge to Protestants coming home. I don't know if this is true, but I do know that I walked that bridge. I do know that Tony Palmer was a bridge for me, and I walked over that bridge to Rome. that speech I heard by Tony Palmer talking about Pope Francis was instrumental in me coming back home to the Catholic Church. And then he introduced Pope Francis to over 100 evangelicals. And again, Pope Francis spoke our language, and he spoke to me. And I was so touched, I got tears in my eyes, that this Catholic Pope would speak to me with such a love, like I was his brother. And then I studied Pope Francis's life, and I seen that he was always this godly man. When he was a young priest, they called him a slum priest, because he would go into the slums of Argentina. He would travel on buses and subways, and I'm from Jersey, and it's not fun riding buses and subways. And he would travel hours to be in the slums, to be with the people that were suffering the most, drug addicts, prostitutes, sinners, and he ministered to them. And the parents said that he brought such love and hope into their hopeless families. And I heard about him being superior to his order, like the highest ranking priest. And they said, even though they were poor, this was in Argentina, he said they were even poor. They said like they would share one meal that, like in America, each person would have. They'd share amongst all of them. They were that poor. Yet they had so much joy, because Pope Francis would lead them into the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And they said he was such a deeply spiritual man. He had such a deep relationship with Jesus Christ. He could bring them to these places they've never been. But what impressed me the most, that they said even though he was their superior, he would iron their clothes. He would cook for them. He acted like their servant. And it reminded me of the story of James and John, who Jesus jokingly called the sons of thunder. When they said, Jesus, you said ask whatever you want. I want to be on your right side and my brother on your left side when you're in glory. And Jesus said, if you want to be great, you have to become the least. The Son of God did not come into the world to be served, but to serve. And what a great example of Pope Francis as a servant. And even as he went into the Vatican, he refused to live in a suite that was suited for a prince. Instead, he chose to live in the servants' quarters. He never forgot that he was a servant. And then when I read that there was this beautiful palace they were renovating, spending millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars from what I understand, to make this beautiful palace that was donated by a wealthy Catholic heiress to the Vatican. And before Pope Francis got there, the plan was to renovate it and rent out these rooms, and bring money in for the church, a good cause. But Pope Francis said, no, this will be a palace for the poor. I forget the name of the palace. It's in Italian, but it translated into English, the palace of the best. Pope Francis gave the palace of the best to the least. And he allowed homeless to come there. And he said, beauty heals. It was a beautiful palace with beautiful, expensive art. And homeless people come there and eat. And he sits down there with them like a servant and eats with them and talks with them. And I heard testimony of homeless women, prostitutes, that said they received so much healing because of this place of the best. And again, it reminded me, Jesus said, what you do to the least of these, you do unto me. Again, this man was so Christ-like. And as I thought about Pope Francis, and I'll probably never get to meet him to say this to him, but I thought in my head about the scene from The Godfather, where Michael Corleone, who wanted nothing to do with his father, nothing to do with the family, went to the hospital and seen his father was under attack, that the enemies of his family tried to kill his father. And he had an epiphany. He realized his father was a good father. And he held his hand and he said, Papa, this is Michael. And I'm with you now. And in my head and in my heart, I said, Pope Francis, Papa, this is Rob. I'm with you. I'm with you now. And I started this channel, and I knew I would have to defend Pope Francis from a lot of Protestants like me, and I would get comments repeating lies about Pope Francis, and I would say, dear brother, I was a Protestant like you once, and I believe these lies. And the reply was, I'm not Protestant, I'm Catholic. I was like, what the heck? And I realized he was getting arrows. His own children were attacking him. And I know some were doing it for financial reasons. The ones in the comments were just repeating what they heard on YouTube. And, and some, the love of money is the root of all evil. And a lot of these YouTubers do it for financial reasons. But I found the bigger picture was most of them were doing it because, unlike the conversion I had, unlike Pope Francis, who knew the Lord, these people were like Pharisees. They were just following a set of rules. They never met Jesus. They never had a transformation, a conversion. They just followed the rules. And Pope Francis was like just loving sinners. And it reminded me of the Pharisees. They called Jesus a friend of sinners, like that was a bad thing. And Jesus was a friend of sinners. Thank God for all of us that he was, And I read, I see this video, this mad YouTuber said, Pope Francis had lunch with transgender people. I'm like, oh, that's so terrible. Let's see why he did this. Well, apparently he invited like over 1,000 prostitutes and homeless people, or homeless prostitutes rather, into the Vatican for lunch and to minister to them. And there was about 10 of those homeless hookers who call themselves transgender. So I thought, wow, these Pharisees today are condemning Pope Francis for eating with prostitutes and sinners, just like the Pharisees in Jesus' day condemned him for eating with prostitutes and sinners. I'm like, this man is so Christ-like. I just fell more in love with him. And as the lies would come out, I would debunk the lies. They would say, oh, Pope Francis is going to ordain women. I'm like, what are you talking about? He changed canon law to say anybody who ordains a woman will be excommunicated. But they just kept pounding away. No, that's his plan. And they just believed these lies. And I realized just like the Pharisees, they didn't understand Jesus, because Jesus was more concerned about the heart of the sinner than the letter of the law. Although he never broke the law, and Pope Francis has never broke any canon law or any church tradition, but his main concern is about the heart of the sinner. And so just like the Pharisees in Jesus' day couldn't understand Jesus, the Pharisees in our days can't understand Pope Francis. But Pope Francis has done so many great things for the church, just quietly over his 10 or 11 years. The worst scandal in church history, the abuse of little children, is over. I think it's like, it used to be thousands every year. Now it's like 2 or 3. Compared to the Chicago public school system in America, where there's 3,000 a year for one little city. So although, one is way too many, according to experts, say because of the efforts Pope Francis has done, the scandal is over. The greatest scandal in the church history is over. And the financial scandal as well. You don't hear about that. He solved that. He does all these things quietly. He doesn't brag about it. He's doing so much, and all he's getting is criticized. He's bringing armies of evangelicals like myself back into the church because he talks our language. He's bringing the Orthodox back in the communion. Slowly but surely, it's happening, my brothers and sisters, right before our eyes. And this is the greatest prayer of Jesus. Father, let them be one as we are one. That was his last prayer. That's how important it was to Jesus. And Pope Francis is doing this. But of course, the devil hates it. So the devil is slinging arrows of lies and hate. But Pope Francis just keeps going on with the joy of the Lord, smiling. Again, he had some comedians, and told them it's a blessing that you guys can make people laugh and smile. And of course, the Pharisees are like, half of these people are unbelievers and they're vulgar. Again, he's being criticized for being a friend of sinners. Thank God Jesus was a friend of sinners, or we would all be condemned to hell. So Pope Francis has done so much, and I can make this video an hour longer with every wonderful things. But my friends in this conference will be also telling you some great things about Pope Francis. But based on what I just told you and what my friends are about to tell you, I am convinced that Pope Francis is a living saint. So I just want to say, Papa, I'm with you now. God bless and stay Catholic.